Catherine is, I looked at your bio ahead of time, but I'm just going to do this by memory, Catherine. Catherine is a researcher. She's a psychologist. She's an author of many books. She is a mom. She is a wife. She's a sister. She is a mentor to many. She is a friend to many. She's the founder of Yogis in Service, which is a nonprofit in Buffalo, New York, that offers yoga in many different settings. And I'm very proud and happy and grateful to call her a friend and a colleague and just a wonderful person in my life. And so I'm very happy to welcome you all here. Welcome, Catherine. Thanks for taking the time to chat with me tonight or today.
Yeah. So I'm on the East Coast, so it's noon here.
Okay.
Thank you. That was so lovely.
Well, it's clearly becoming dark, which just means it's the afternoon in London. But it's really nice to be here with you. So I listed off a bunch of different things because and when we were preparing for this, one thing that struck me is I was like, gosh, Catherine's got such a diverse professional life. And I know more than most people that you are, while you've part of why we came together is that you specialize in yoga and eating disorders and have a passion for science and nonprofit work. You work in so many different areas. So I know you've worked with the UN Foundation, you've worked with Africa Yoga Project, you work in research, you do stuff in your local community. So I wondered if you could tell us a little bit about how you understand what you do and also what you see as the common through line, because it might look like a bunch of different pieces, but maybe you could tell us a little bit about what is the central theme in your work.
Well, it's embodied self-regulation. So ultimately, what that's my dog Finnegan. I've always been interested since I was a kid in what it is that helps people that are able to self-regulate, to be present in the moment and be the best version of themselves. And what happens when people can't, and then what kinds of things like addictions, like eating disorders, manifest from maybe an attempt to self-regulate or from a lack of self-regulation, that whole thing. And so I just have been in that inquiry for many years in all different ways for a while. And I'm still interested in this. I'm very curious about symbolic representation as it occurs through language and reading, and how that's part of our kind of shared narrative, and how we understand our own trauma and our own dysregulation, and how that narrative shifts, and then how the shifts in the narrative and our misunderstandings dysregulate each other. There's so much to it. But ultimately, discovering yoga in my 30s through a student was a very powerful time in my life. And doing yoga and experiencing the shifts in my own body in the practicing, without a substance, without someone else, like it was just my body was down regulating itself. I wasn't exhausted after swim practice or after a run. It was in the moment, a shift of turning inward and integration and down regulation that I had been searching for. And then from there forward, I said, I'm studying this. And so now any way I can study it or work with it, I do.
Oh, that's great. So, and I want to come back to this in our time today. It's just this idea of the personal and the academic and the nonprofit kind of colliding. Before we do though, you're such an intelligent human that I'm like, my initial thought was have Catherine explain what self-regulation is like she were explaining it to a 6-year-old. Because I'm like, you're so immersed in the research and stuff that I'm like, sometimes even though we've heard those words before, we can breeze over them and go, oh right, self-regulation or embodiment and that sort of stuff. So if you were explaining this to your daughter when she was really young, what do you mean when you say self-regulation or states of dysregulation or that? Because you kind of got into it with like present moment, but when you talk about that, what do you mean by self-regulation? What is it? What does that really come down to?
So it comes down to noticing noticing how you're doing, which is a big ask for little guys, because their noticing part of their brain doesn't develop till into the later elementary school years unless you teach and train and practice. But it's about noticing and then experiencing at the same time, and then the choices you make between noticing and experiencing to move in that moment and through that moment. So for a little person, maybe sometimes they notice when their feelings feel really big that it's hard to make good choices that don't hurt somebody else or themselves. And so you're like, wow, I noticed when your feelings got really big right there. It was tough. And you said some things that hurt your sister. And I'm wondering about how we could have big feelings, right? And still maybe feel it all, but maybe not hurt your sister, right? And so let's try some things. And the one of the first things to do is really up front kind of go, oh, I feel a big feeling coming. Or you know what? I noticed that when we're supposed to have dinner at 5 and it's 5:30, I have a lot of big feelings between those two times. And then so what could I do when I'm noticing I'm hungry and then I'm mad and I'm right? And so for a little person, it's actually kind of fun. I'll even draw them a picture of the brain and show them where the feeling part of our brain is and where the thinking part is. And then we talk about what kinds of things get the feeling brain going so big that the thinking brain can't help out. And then maybe we practice things like pushing our feet into the floor, feeling our hearts beat, using our breath. And then we notice that that helps the feeling part be seen and calm down. And it helps the thinking part help us out. So we make better choices. So it's that kind of thing. For grown-ups, it really is about, you know, the universe, God, whoever, grant me the ability to see, right, when my dysregulation's coming. So I have an awareness. And then when it's here, I notice what's happening, how big that feeling is. I have the skills to be with it, to tolerate it, to experience it, to listen, and then make choices in that moment, which can include pausing, right? And noticing it as it passes, or a whole bunch of other things, so that I can serve my greater values and hopes and dreams and not undermine myself or sabotage myself or hurt someone else. Is that
That's so clear. That's so useful. And it leads me like perfectly into the next question, which is what role does yoga play in that, or meditation or mindfulness practice? So you've described it really clearly. And where do these practices that you've really built your career around, where do they come in?
yeah, my husband, I'm sure, I know this isn't his quote, but it's something he often uses with his patients, and then I cite him. But it's really hard to learn how to swim when you feel like you're drowning. And so if I want to be better at managing big feelings or physiological distress, pain, discomfort, grief, whatever it is, I really want to practice before the moment hits. Although if it hits and you're underwater, like that, that's what psychologists are for. And absolutely you can get help. But what if all of us learned the skills when we weren't drowning? When we could practice up for when those big moments came. So as you're in a yoga class, you learn to, I mean, for some people, it takes work just to notice their own heartbeat. And that's where you start with emotional literacy, really. And is that first, I noticed that I have a heartbeat, because heartbeat, breath rate, your whole nervous system response, that's part of noticing you're having a feeling, right? So sometimes I start just with heartbeat. In yoga, like we're just always tuning into the body, building up the insula, which helps us with what we call interoceptive awareness, or awareness of what's happening inside of me. So when you build up those skills that I can notice my body, I know when my body feels regulated. I know what that feels like. I know what calm feels like, right? I know what presence feels like because I'm practicing that. I notice what being triggered feels like, or upregulated feels like. I notice what happens when I deeply breathe as my heart rate is increased. So I learn all these skills, just so many I can't even begin to say, all that you can learn on the mat that's going to change your life when you're in an argument with someone you love. When I teach yoga, I just constantly teach to that we are skilling up so that when the really important moments happen off the mat, we're ready. It doesn't mean we'll be perfect, but God, if I could even notice to say, like, you know what, I know enough about this, I know enough about myself that I should not be talking right now. Like, that's God, what a gift that is. You know what I mean? That I should stop talking, right? So we notice enough to stop ourselves, or we notice enough to take a moment and ground and breathe before we use our voices or our hands, or yeah.
So good. That, what I'm hearing is that the first step in self-regulation is the ability to notice what's happening inside of yourself. I'm thinking of a couple moments. Sometimes when we teach courses, you know, our work intersects, and when we're working, we talk a lot about interoception, and interoception being your ability to sense what's happening inside of your body. And I'll say, you know, what are some things you can sense inside your body? And someone will say, anger. And it's like, well, kind of,
Yeah.
kind of.
Yeah.
Yeah, anger is the emergent is the emergent emotion. What happens inside of your body that tells you that you're angry? And then you know, it's really about developing literacy. I was also thinking about a moment that happened recently that I sometimes forget has come from years of yoga practice, where I was able to go, I'm having a lot happen inside of me right now, and I need a moment to just digest the reality of this moment before I can move on to the next moment. Actually saying it out loud with someone. But that's, yeah, that's a really big part of it. The of, I think, self-regulation and embodiment and this work. Um, I'm also wondering, you know, there's the ability to name what's happening inside of you, and then I think there's got to also be a second piece to self-regulation too, because it's like the ability to name it. But do you think, is it just waiting for the feeling to shift, or do you think yoga or embodiment can play some role in kind of consciously shifting our own state, internal state? You know, it's like, okay, I'm noticing that my heart is beating out of my chest really quickly, and is there something I can do about it? Yeah, how do
Yeah.
you see that?
Yeah. So, yeah. So Phyllis was saying, name it to tame it in the chat. Um, so actually, in naming it is almost like a second step. Um, so a lot, and I talk about this. I talk about this in my most recent book, and
Get it, girl. Get it.
and we really came up with this concept working with our Peace on Purpose work with the UN Foundation, and developing curriculum with them and having long discussions about what goes on in the body. But essentially, um, there's the first part of like noticing and simply being with what's there long enough to get a full sense of it. It's what you just said, like, wait a minute, there's so much going on in this moment. I need to be in it for long enough that I have a sense of what's going on. Once you're being with something, so just to be with, then there's the option of working with. I think in that, and I don't know if it's quite be with or work with, is the naming it. Like, but sometimes the naming it's on the end of being with, like, oh, this is my anxiety, or oh, this is my reaction to this relationship and my past, like all being here right now, whatever it is. Um, but what I've come to learn through yoga and mindfulness is that in our culture, when I say our culture, my culture, I guess I could say, is really Western experiences of the body and mind, typically, is to almost immediately go to work with it, right? Like, oh, so here it is. Now, what are the, 5 best tools to fix this or change this or shift this? And so what yoga and mindfulness has really taught me that many times being with is enough. Being with is enough. And we almost like mess it up by jumping in too quickly, because it's not done yet and it needs to be soak in and process and tell us. The present moment has a lot to tell us. Our past has a lot to tell us. And when we try to fix it too fast, we can actually like short circuit the natural process of things just moving through us in our lives. So embodiment really and self-regulation, a big part of it is being with what is, right? I mean, in mindfulness, pretty much you'll just keep hearing, be with what is, be with what is. So allowing that, and for any moment and any person and any time, that could be 3 seconds or it could be 3 years. Do you know, so the being with isn't like from 5 to 7 seconds, be with it. And then, as a rule, move forward to, right? It's that I have to be with it long enough and be in inquiry with it and presence to just kind of know what's next and then learning how to do that. And then when it's time, if it's right, work with it in some way. And it's when you kind of start thinking like that being with is enough so much of the time. Can I tell you a little story from a patient a long time ago?
Yes, please.
I talk about this, so I'll tell the story. I switch it up enough so that I'm not kind of telling someone's specific story. But a little girl was telling me how upset she was, and she had, oftentimes not felt seen by her mom. And I said, well, tell me about a time when you kind of most appreciate your mom, or something kind of that you remember best about your mom. And she goes, well, one time I was really upset and I just was um, feeling extremely overwhelmed. I'm kind of using adult language. I'm interpreting it through my own voice here. Um, and she ran and she hid under
Mhm.
her bed. And she, uh, she was just there and her mom was looking for her and yelling her name. And finally her mom found her and she was sobbing. The mother was obviously worried. And the mother just scooched in and put her hand on her and just laid with her. And she goes, that's the nicest thing my mom ever did. And it was the power of being with. And I keep thinking like whenever I'm upset or my patients are upset or people are like, they rarely say like, I really wanted my friend to do something. They wanted their friend to be with them, to just be with them, put a hand on their back. And so think of the times when we can be that for ourselves, that we just ground our feet and we breathe, maybe place a hand on your heart and just be in the moment, like with complete, this is self-regulation, right? Like, so it's that in real time. That's what it can be like. And we don't do that for each other. And so we so rarely do it for ourselves.
Yeah, I was just thinking that. I was like, that's exactly what it is being with yourself in that way. Um, Gosh, I could linger, and I'm also going into interview mode, and I'm like, okay, I would be remiss not to, at some point in this interview, do something that's quite uh, oh, I just don't think it's traditional in the academic world. But Catherine, you've got so much insight, and when I read your books, and we've been working together over the past few years on this research project, and I remember I was reading, I think it was Esther's dissertation, which is one of your graduate students who did work on our program. I'm reading it, and I'm like, oh my god, this is like I am so on board with it. She's citing all of your papers, and I'm like, oh my gosh, I'm literally like could have taken the words out of my mouth. I'm 100% on board with this. I was having all these insights after knowing you for years, but not actually, you know, to see it all laid out and citations 10 years ago and 8 years ago and 6 years ago. I think the thing that I'm most interested in, and that I think a lot of people I hope that people that are arriving here today and that are here with us tonight or today, wherever you are, wonder about us. I'm like, how did you get there, Catherine? How did you get? How did those insights personally come to um, grow and flourish in you? Because I know that, I know it's not something that we commonly talk about in academia, but can you talk a little bit about your own journey and yes, your yoga experience, but what informs your research? And that could be client work, it could be personal experiences, it could be a combination of all of it. But how did you get to have some of these insights around self-regulation and embodiment and the importance of those things?
Well, like I said, since I was little, I kind of was wondering why people are like they are. And then more specifically, like many of us, like, how did I end up like this? What the heck went wrong? Right. And and I write this in the book. And I've written a blog on it too. But I think it was ninth grade where I officially was diagnosed with an eating disorder. Um, and then suffered for years with that disorder in various forms and manifestations. And there became this pretty substantial split between who I was in a way that I knew and who my friends, people I was acquainted with, or my family knew. And I was spending a large amount of time managing the impressions and the illusions. And then as I um, moved forward, I was really developing my academic career and my practice career, becoming a psychologist at the same time that I was also researching. And I just wanted to understand that and see if there were other models for that. And there really weren't a lot. And so then I just started sketching out and trying to explain it to myself and understand it. And that's where I came up with the attunement model, really inspired by Dan Siegel's work when he talked about interpersonal attunement. And that's really where I first had heard that word used in an interpersonal way was Dan Siegel's book, The Developing Mind, I think was published in 96. Um, and all of the interpersonal neurobiology work that he and his colleagues started doing, and now to the polyvagal theory and all of that, fascinating stuff. And thinking through like what happens if the self that you're putting out there in the world isn't who you are, and that I was always trying to make myself look like and be like what everyone else wanted me to be. I I think like a lot of my patients was a really sensitive kid and I could feel a lot. The way I describe it to my patients often is, and they'll be like, "Oh my gosh," that's people can go to a party and if somebody's very empathic or attuned, they'll know who in the room is fighting, who in the room is too drunk, who in the room is, XYZ. Now, meanwhile, that's me at the party. My husband can go to the same party and be like, that was some great dip. Did you try that? Like, and he's got no, I go, did you see they were fighting? And did you see, do you know? And he's like, no. And so there's this additional input that comes in for some nervous systems. And whether it's because a person's genetically predisposed or you're raised in an environment where scanning and monitoring what's going on becomes an important part of your survival. And then the behavioral adaptation is I'm going to attune to what's needed out here. And then we inadvertently abandon our own internal needs, so much so that I have patients that can't feel their own heartbeats, that don't know when they're hungry, that don't know when is the last time they drink water. They don't know how to rest because they're so oriented toward meeting the needs outside. And then that can shift to being the perfect student and looking the perfect way and being the perfect friend. And not a friend, a perfect friend, which are two really different things. A good friend and a perfect friend are different. And the term I always come to with this is that hungry ghost, because that kind of presentation doesn't satisfy and people don't like it. It doesn't feel attuned because it's not real. And so you seeking the alignment with the outside with a false self ultimately never satisfies. And then the eating disorder ends up kind of creeping into that space where your own self is never seen. And you end up in this, and then I think this happens in substance use too, this aligned and attunement with your disorder and this misrepresentation with everyone else in the world. Like the only thing that really knows you is your disorder. So then I'm coming to treatment and you're like, give up the disorder. Like that's my best friend. I mean, Jen Schaefer writes in all her stuff like this kind of breaking up with Ed, but it really rings true to that sense of, you know, no one's ever really there for me, but gosh, this glass of wine is, or gosh, my binge eating disorder is, right? And so we have that sense of attunement with the disorder and a lack of attunement with the outer world. It's a false attunement. And that's, you know, and for me, it was something, it's really important to me that it rings true in my own body, as well as then, wow, well, can this ring true out in the research? Like, so experiment one is always going on here. And then like, well, is this generalizable or is it just my truth? Right? Like, is this true for others? And so then I constantly ask those questions. Does that make sense?
Oh my God, more than you know. So much. Yeah, it definitely does. But I think that's part of, Catherine, why you and I have connected is it's like it first makes sense on a personal life experience. It's like, oh yeah, I know that so well, in myself, in people I love, in clients I work with. And then there's also, I think, a mutual curiosity around, what does this tell us about the human experience? And is this something that's unique to one particular temperament, or is this something that, lots of people deal with? I'm just wishing I had so much more time in this interview because you could dig into any bit of this. And I'm just trying to pick where I want to go next because there's so many places one could go. I'm going to follow my gut though, because we're kind of digging into this. I could go into, maybe we could table it, but like, how do you actually ask those questions scientifically? So I'll just bookmark that. We might come to that around to it at the
Yeah.
end. But the most natural and organic place to go, I sent you a question via email ahead of time. And I said in the email, I said, this is a question I've been grappling with my entire life and my career, which is why is it that some people who struggle with what we call or name or label or diagnose as mental illness, eating disorders, addiction, anxiety, depression, which are really, in my view, human experiences and expressions of suffering. Why is it that some people who deal with these things, what I guess what's the variable in your that you've why do some of them seem to crumble in the face of these things, and why do some people seem to get to the other side? Is there a common variable in what helps a person get through, um, make it out of, or probably more likely, integrate those experiences into who they are and become better people? And what is your work and your life told you about that question? I don't know if I was a very verbose way of talking about it, but hopefully it came across.
No, I know. Well, that's because I think you trying to formulate that question is as complicated as trying to answer it. Like it's a gigantic question. It's like the question of, really psychology, right? Why do some people seem to have access to well-being and then others, you know, struggle in ways, I mean, there's a lot of questions in there. What is psychopathology? And is it just because everybody else doesn't do it and it's only so many people and et cetera, et cetera? You know, but I think I wish it was one thing because then it would be really easy, but it's not. It's the model that came out in the 90s was biopsychosocial, and it really is that interface between what you're born with genetically and then some of it's just bad luck or good luck, or right, the chance that this set of variables all fell in place at the same time in your life, and then what what resources were there for you? What skills did you have to negotiate them? And I love Anita Johnson's Eating by the Light of the Moon, where she's like, you fell off the edge of the, it's like maybe the first chapter or one of the first few, you fall off you're looking at the raging river, and you know, you inadvertently fall in, and there you are, and you're drowning, and you know, you grab a log, and that log might be, well, for in this case is an eating disorder, but sometimes it's, you know, substance use, and so it, or a whole bunch of different things, right? But that log gets you through. And so I try to frame it that way. I try not to come at it too pathologically, and just like, hey, this is the log you grabbed, and it did help you get through, but now, like, there's this harm that's happening, right? There's, you know, there pesky, you know, side effects of or if it's anorexia, I mean, there's only so we'll run out of time. Like if dieting or restricting or, you know, is the only way you can feel better, then you're giving us like only this much time, and we need more time to learn the skills. Like, so I need you to take in more nutrients so that we have more time to learn the skills, right? There's some of these disorders come with a really short timeline and are very dangerous. And maybe they got you through the crisis, but now it's time for us to figure out what was their role in your life. That's the part. And that's where I work. And like figuring out what the role, the disorder, or whatever it is that you're kind of using right now that's not really workable, but it is workable. Like it worked, but it's not workable. How do we get that, figure out what it was doing, and then skill up, resource up, support up, so that that doesn't have to be the main thing we go to, and maybe we can eventually just let it go altogether. Does that make sense? So I always work at the kind of how is it functioning in your life? And then in the research, we are constantly looking like what's the role and what in this person's profile, right, created the vulnerable spot that had a role in survival.
Yeah, that makes total sense. I think it's, you know, both. It's both. I think what psychology tends to be really good at, in my experience, both on both sides of the system, both as somebody that was, you know, being given treatment and then somebody who's been part of the healthcare system for a long time, is that psychology is really good at help, in my experience, again, at helping you figure out what is it that went what is it that went wrong that made you grab onto the log to begin with. What are the problems? I think the harder thing, and maybe where yoga and mindfulness and embodiment practices, at least for me, have been so useful, is it's like, okay, I get it. I've spent 10 years figuring out all the things that went wrong that made me grab onto that log. I could write a book about it. I could write several books about it. And that phrase you just used, how do I resource up? How do I skill up? Or how do I get to a point where I can let go of the log and let my human experience evolve beyond clinging to this log desperately? Because, you know, it might not be, I think in Anita Johnson's metaphor, it's like a really raging river, or at least this may be the story. I don't know if this is true. I may not be quoting her, but in my head, it was a really raging river. You grab onto the log to like keep afloat, and then the like water slows down, and you're still clinging onto the log for like dear life. And if you cling on much longer, there's like a waterfall at the end, and you're gonna like, it's like time to let go of the log.
Oh,
Um,
and your friends are all at the shore and they're like,
yeah.
Chelsea,
Hey.
come hang out. And you're like, "No, I
Such a
will."
cozy log. It's so soft. I just like to cuddle up to it. Oh,
Here's the other part is how do I not want to anymore? Right. And so what I find to be true is that the self and Rob asked a really interesting question in the chat that I'm going to get to too. That what are the self-regulating parts of yoga? Like I'll tell people like wine will ruin your yoga and yoga will ruin your wine drinking, right? Because there's something about when you practice that it like I remember the first time I did yoga and I was 35 and I was in Shavasana. And it was the first time I felt that relaxed without 2 glasses of Cabernet. And which is sad that to know, but my nervous system didn't know. I knew how to be, I was a Division 1 athlete. I like was a runner, everything that I was like, you know, pursuing, you know, a PhD. At that time, trying to get tenure, everything I knew about life, how to succeed was to press the gas pedal more. And I had no tools for not. Um, and so, and here's Rob's question: could yoga be a double-edged sword? It could be, if it's helping you press that gas pedal more and your body really needs to do the other thing. Now, some people like, could you, like, it depends, right? So there's no type of yoga that's necessarily good or bad. It's how are you using it in terms of really nurturing your nervous system and befriending your body. And I needed at that time to learn how to downregulate without a substance. So once I wasn't using the eating disorder to do that, I would use a substance to do it. And I just had zero other tools. And I remember looking at people going like, they just seem so calm, and sober. Like, how do they do that? And I would have to literally run 10 miles and exhaust myself, right? And you can't do that all the time. That won't work, right? Or have a couple glasses of wine. And I thought it must just be that they're lucky, that they have bodies that feel calmer than mine, right? And so yoga was like this first time I was like, oh wait, my body can do this, all by itself. So, and then when you're in a state of integration and regulation, you're not as compulsively craving in that way. So it's like you don't have to. What's hard is if I have my patients constantly craving and they have to constantly try not, like if you're trying to quit smoking and you want to, that's a long day. But what if we can get you to, oh, I didn't even think of it today. Like that's where and so that's where mindfulness, um and I would say more specifically embodied practices like yoga, where you're not just calming yourself down, but you're present, pressing your foot into the mat, and your awareness is tied to the sensations, because this comes right up through your nervous system into the underneath layers of your brain, and then the cortex. The like bottom three and top three layers of your cortex actually have to come together at the area between your third and fourth layers, and then move to your frontal lobe. Like you're creating an integrated brain. So when you're done, you're more integrated every time. So you see somebody who's been practicing for 10 years, it's a different entity, like it's a different nervous system than somebody who just started, right? You actually can, this is Siegel, but you can change the architecture of your own brain. But you have to pick a practice and match it where you are that's going to create that integration, and don't just use it. Matt Sanford, in his book Waking, talks about how you can use yoga to hurt yourself. And it's like a beautiful passage in his book. But you can use anything to hurt yourself, including yoga. So it's really about using it to 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 really befriend and partner with your own nervous system. Does that make sense?
It does. It does. And I'm like, oh my God, we're going to need a part two. We're going to need a part two to this interview because there's so many places I want to go with that. And I'm also going, okay, we've got 4 or 5 minutes left and we've got a collection of really, really wonderful questions here. So I'm going to use this as a jumping off point. One thing that, even if I only get to this one, and I'm kind of pulling this as a common theme in some of the questions that are showing up in the chat, I guess, Catherine, we've talked a lot about mechanisms. I think a little bit. We're using anecdotes from clients from our own experience to talk about it. But I know we have a lot of yoga teachers and yoga therapists that are probably nodding along and can match this up with their own experience, or can see this in family members, kids, friends. Are there elements, do you think, that someone who's offering a yoga, meditation, contemplative practice that they could integrate in their classes? And of course, there's the challenge of teaching to a group versus an individual. But are there specific elements, regardless of the type of practice they're teaching, that one could integrate to support and foster and cultivate the skills that we're talking about that seem to be so instrumental in healing?
Yeah, I mean, you can look across the various trainings. Like I'm thinking of David Emerson's work, and all that he's done in the trauma center, trauma sensitive yoga, um, and and across the board, and we're just preparing our teacher training now. So I just recorded a bunch of stuff for just a 200 level training for yoga teachers. But the yoga in and of itself is just, I don't know, such a brilliant practice. Um, but the adding the sticking to the real yoga of it, where you're orienting as a teacher the student or your client's awareness continuously back to the present moment, what they're experiencing, their sensation. So it's that be with. So you're really working with that be with. How can I help them be with this moment and not the past? Like sometimes I'll even say, like, your breath is not, it's not a memory and it's not a plan. Your breath is always right here. Sensations are just right here. So the if you look at there's a great, oh gosh, I'm going to not remember the name of the authors, but there's a relatively recent article about the polyvagal theory and yoga philosophy and how it goes together. But it links up this. It's exactly that we're linking up the nervous system into the present moment, and then asking the big noticer of the frontal orbital cortex to notice. Which every time we do that, we are now increasing the midbrain and our frontal brain's integration. Plus, here in yoga, we're like balancing and coordinating. So we already have like bilateral integration, right? And then with the sequencing, we have all this like way back in the cerebellum part of your brain activated. So you're creating this beautiful integrative space. So the power of just constantly cueing to the moment, to sensations, to the breath, to the heartbeat, and to the noticing is way more powerful than I think we can even give it credit for. And the world just isn't that way, right? And so then I'll ask, now practice this, or what do you notice out in the world, or how can we apply this in the world as a point of reflection? There's so much more. Like the polyvagal theory is just so blah, there's so much to say. But like to me, that is one of the most powerful things we do is building up their skills for being with in the moment.
Yeah, and it seems so simple and it's profound. Is that
Yep.
it's such a simple thing that you can do in any type of practice, whether it's meditation, whether you're teaching a power yoga class, or you're teaching a restorative yoga class, is just anchoring the student or the client or yourself, whatever's there in the practice, to sensation. For one, is one thing I heard you say, to breath, which is there's sensations associated with breath, there's the rhythm of breathing, um, to any cues, to what's around you, to light, to sound, to smell, anything happening in the present moment. Yeah, and if there's an opportunity to give points of reflection, that's wonderful as well. That's such a useful tidbit, and it's a really perfect way to end an interview I don't want to end. Besides that, I think we will do a part two, because while I wrote a beautiful description for our talk, if I know myself, I don't think we got into any of it. We just talked about really cool, substantial, wonderful things. So I'll bring you back to get back here to university if I can nab you for your
No, it's
time.
over. I have yours to say one more thing.
Please, yes, yeah.
So you can be with as you orient, and this you can take from Emerson and Siegel and a bunch of people. But then I use what I noticed while I was being with to then make my choices, right? So that's the thing. Like, so it's even more in that now all of this, I can like decide what's next, and I have agency and self-determination and all of this to decide what's next. So that's like, so there. So you guys practice that at home until we see you again.
You even dropped agency. I couldn't love you anymore. Perfect. Thank you. Catherine, tell us the name of your book that's been recent. I know you've got many, but one book that's recently come out that I was saying before we got on here that all of my facilitators are now starting a book club about. So tell us the name of the book, where people can get it, and where they can connect with you and your research and your work. I know you've got places. Yeah.
Embodied, no, I'm not going to say that wrong. Embodiment. I'm like,
get your book right, woman. Come on.
Embodiment and the treatment of eating disorders. The body as a resource in recovery. And honestly, if you don't work with eating disorders, the model that I use with my patients for a variety of approaches, and I use that approach, the embodiment approach, to really illustrate the process with eating disorders. But even if that's not your area, I think you would find it useful. And then I do have a webpage that your lovely colleague Sam helps me keep up to date. So it's just CatherineCook-Cottone.com.
Yes. And can you repeat the book title one more time because it cut out?
Oh, yeah. Embodiment and the Treatment of Eating Disorders, the Body as a Resource in Recovery.
Wonderful. And I'm also going to tout Catherine's got Yogis in Service, which is her nonprofit in Buffalo, if you're in New York and looking into their work, or just use the good old friendly Google and just, Google stalker. She's got loads out there. And I see a request for a symposium on this topic of yoga and eating disorders. So to be continued. Thank you so much, Catherine. Thank you for being here with me and with us. And thank you for all who joined us tonight.
I'm glad I did it, except for that it makes me miss you more. So.
Oh, I know going through photos today. I was like, oh, runs, campfires. We'll do it again soon.
All right.
Okay.
Thank
All
you so
right.
much.
Thank you. Bye.